Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other military wives. While most spouses stayed home during deployments, she worked as a humanitarian aid coordinator, often traveling to the same dangerous regions where her husband's Delta Force unit operated. At 32, she spoke 4 languages fluently and had spent the last 8 years helping rebuild communities torn apart by conflict. The assignment in Afghanistan seemed routine at first. Sarah was leading a small team to establish a medical clinic in a remote village near the Pakistani border. The area had been cleared by coalition forces months earlier, and intelligence reports suggested the Taliban had moved on to more strategic locations. Her team consisted of Dr. James Harrison, a veteran field medic, Maria Santos, a logistics coordinator, and 2 local interpreters who knew the terrain. Captain Marcus Mitchell, Sarah's husband of 6 years, had initially opposed her taking this particular assignment. The region was still volatile, and his own unit was scheduled to operate in neighboring sectors. But Sarah had convinced him that her work was just as important as his. She was saving lives in a different way, building bridges between cultures, and providing hope to people who had known nothing but war for decades. The village of Coast Matan sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that had sheltered smugglers and militants for centuries. When Sarah's convoy arrived on a dusty Tuesday morning, the village elder, Ahmed Khan, greeted them with cautious optimism. His weathered face told stories of survival that few outsiders could understand. The villagers had learned to be wary of promises from foreigners, but the medical supplies and solar-powered equipment Sarah's team brought offered tangible hope. For 3 weeks, the clinic project progressed smoothly. Sarah worked 18-hour days, coordinating supply deliveries, training local healthcare workers, and building trust with families who had rarely seen medical care. Dr. Harrison established treatment protocols for everything from childhood diseases to trauma injuries. Maria ensured that equipment arrived safely and functioned properly in the harsh mountain environment. The local children especially warmed to Sarah. She carried candy in her pockets and spoke to them in their own language, asking about their families and dreams. Many had never attended school, but Sarah saw intelligence and curiosity in their eyes that reminded her why humanitarian work mattered so much. She began planning an education program to complement the medical clinic. Everything changed on a Thursday evening when Sarah received an encrypted message on her satellite communicator. The transmission came from Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes, the commanding officer of a military contractor unit operating in the region. The message was brief and urgent. Security situation compromised. Immediate extraction required. Grid coordinates attached. Come alone. Sarah stared at the message, her heart racing. Protocol dictated that she inform her team and request guidance from her own headquarters. But the message emphasized coming alone, and Hayes claimed to have intelligence about an imminent attack on the village. If she delayed for approvals and consultations, innocent people might die. She made a decision that would haunt her for months to come. Sarah told her team that she was conducting a routine security meeting with coalition forces and would return by morning. She packed light, just water, basic medical supplies, and her communications equipment. The coordinates led to a remote valley 15 miles from the village, accessible only by a narrow mountain road. The drive took 2 hours in her modified Land Rover. As Sarah climbed higher into the mountains, cell phone coverage disappeared completely, leaving her dependent on satellite communications that worked sporadically in the rocky terrain. The landscape grew increasingly desolate, scattered boulders, thorny scrub vegetation, and occasional evidence of old Soviet-era military positions. When Sarah reached the designated coordinates, she found a temporary military camp that looked professional but somehow wrong. 3 vehicles sat in a defensive perimeter, and 8 men in military fatigues waited under a camouflage shelter. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes appeared to be in his late 40s, with graying hair and the confident bearing of a career soldier. But something in his eyes made Sarah immediately uncomfortable. Hayes introduced his team as private military contractors working on classified operations in the region. He claimed that Taliban forces were planning a major offensive that would target the village where Sarah's clinic operated. According to his intelligence, the attack would come within 48 hours, and all foreign personnel needed to evacuate immediately. Sarah questioned the intelligence, asking why her own organization hadn't received similar warnings. Hayes became evasive, claiming that his sources operated outside normal channels. He insisted that she couldn't return to warn her team because doing so would compromise the informants and make the attack more likely. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Hayes becoming increasingly aggressive in his demands that Sarah accompany his unit to a secure location. When she insisted on returning to evacuate her team properly, Hayes nodded to his men. Two contractors moved to block her path to the Land Rover while others began breaking camp with suspicious efficiency. Sarah realized with growing horror that she had walked into a trap. These men weren't interested in protecting anyone. They wanted her isolated and vulnerable for reasons she couldn't yet understand. When she demanded to know what was really happening, Hayes dropped all pretense of cooperation. The contractors were involved in illegal arms trafficking, selling weapons to various factions regardless of their political affiliations. Sarah's humanitarian work had inadvertently documented their supply routes and meeting locations through her detailed mapping of the region. Her reports to aid organizations contained enough evidence to expose the entire operation. Hayes explained that they had originally planned to simply intimidate Sarah into leaving the region quietly. But when that approach failed, they decided on a more permanent solution. The remote location had been chosen carefully, far from any coalition patrols, and impossible to reach without detailed knowledge of the mountain roads. Sarah's military training with her husband's unit had taught her to recognize tactical situations. She was outnumbered 8-1, with no backup communications and no one expecting her return for several hours. The contractors had the advantage of terrain, firepower, and surprise, but they had also made a critical mistake. They underestimated her determination and resourcefulness. As the contractors finished packing their equipment, Sarah noticed that they were preparing to leave her stranded without vehicle, water, or communications. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. She would either die of exposure in the mountains or be found by hostile local forces. Either way, she wouldn't be able to expose their weapons trafficking operation. Hayes confiscated her satellite communicator and removed key components from her Land Rover's engine, ensuring that she couldn't drive to safety or call for help. He left her with only the clothes on her back and a half-empty water bottle, claiming that this gave her a sporting chance to survive until rescue arrived. The contractors departed in their convoy, leaving Sarah alone in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. The nearest friendly forces were at least 50 miles away, across terrain controlled by various militant groups. The temperature would drop below freezing after sunset, and she had no shelter or warm clothing. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't an ordinary humanitarian aid worker. Her years with Marcus had taught her basic survival skills, and her work in conflict zones had shown her how to adapt and improvise under extreme pressure. She also knew something that Hayes and his men didn't. Marcus's Delta Force unit was operating somewhere in the region, and they would never stop looking for her. As the sound of the contractors' vehicles faded into the distance, Sarah began taking inventory of her situation. The abandoned campsite contained scattered debris that might prove useful: empty water containers, scraps of rope, and fragments of military equipment. The surrounding terrain offered both challenges and opportunities for someone trained to think tactically. She had perhaps 6 hours of daylight remaining to find shelter and establish a defensive position. The contractors had chosen the location for its isolation, but that same remoteness might work in her favor if she could avoid detection long enough for rescue forces to locate her. Sarah began moving carefully through the campsite, collecting anything that might aid her survival. A discarded poncho could provide shelter from wind and rain. Empty ammunition boxes could store water if she found a source. Even seemingly useless items like wire and plastic sheeting might become critical tools in the right circumstances. The first priority was water. Her half-bottle wouldn't last more than a day in the desert climate, and dehydration would kill her faster than cold or militants. Sarah remembered seeing a dry stream bed during her approach to the campsite. If she could find the source, there might be springs or seasonal pools higher in the mountains. As she prepared to leave the campsite, Sarah heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. For a moment, her heart soared with hope that rescue had already begun. But the aircraft sound faded quickly, moving in the wrong direction. It served as a reminder that other forces operated in these mountains, some friendly, others decidedly hostile. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Sarah started climbing toward the apparent water source. Each step took her higher into terrain where temperatures would drop rapidly after dark. But staying near the abandoned campsite meant certain discovery by whoever controlled this particular valley. Behind her, tire tracks and boot prints told the story of the contractor's deception. Ahead lay unknown dangers and the slim hope that her survival skills would prove sufficient until help arrived. Sarah Mitchell had been abandoned in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, but she refused to surrender without a fight. The real test was just beginning. Captain Marcus Mitchell knew something was wrong before anyone officially reported Sarah missing. They had been married long enough for him to recognize the subtle changes in communication patterns that meant trouble. Sarah always sent her daily status reports at exactly 1800 hours local time, a habit formed during years of operating in dangerous environments. When 2,000 hours passed without contact, Marcus felt the familiar knot of dread that every special operations soldier learns to trust. His Delta Force unit was conducting surveillance operations 40 miles southeast of Sarah's location, monitoring suspected Taliban supply routes through the mountain passes. The mission required complete radio silence except for emergency communications, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah needed help. His team leader, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had learned to trust Marcus's instincts about his wife's safety. The official missing person report came through military channels 12 hours later. Dr. Harrison had contacted Sarah's headquarters when she failed to return from her supposed security meeting. Her Land Rover's GPS tracker showed that she had driven to an isolated valley before the signal was lost, presumably due to equipment failure or interference. Military protocol required a methodical search and rescue operation coordinated through proper command channels. Search grids would be established, reconnaissance flights scheduled, and ground teams deployed based on resource availability and threat assessments. The process was professional, thorough, and tragically slow for someone potentially dying of exposure in hostile territory. Marcus requested permission to join the search operation immediately, but his commanding officer, Colonel Patterson, initially refused. Military regulations prohibited personnel from participating in rescue missions involving family members, citing concerns about emotional compromise affecting tactical judgment. Marcus would have to wait like any other military spouse while others searched for his wife. But Delta Force operators don't reach their elite status by accepting limitations that others consider absolute. Marcus had spent 8 years developing relationships and earning trust that transcended official protocols. When he approached Master Sergeant Rodriguez privately, he found a man willing to bend rules for a proven teammate. Rodriguez understood that Marcus wasn't requesting special treatment. He was offering specialized capabilities that might save Sarah's life. Marcus knew his wife's training, habits, and psychological responses better than any search coordinator. He also possessed language skills and cultural knowledge that could prove crucial when dealing with local populations who might have witnessed events in the remote valley. The decision to launch an unofficial parallel search required careful coordination with other team members. Sergeant First Class Thompson, the unit's communications specialist, quietly monitored search and rescue frequencies while maintaining their official mission profile. Staff Sergeant Kim, an expert tracker and survival instructor, volunteered to analyze terrain features that might influence Sarah's survival choices. They developed a plan that would allow Marcus to participate in the search while maintaining plausible deniability for the rest of the team. Marcus would take emergency leave to visit Sarah's last known location, officially traveling as a concerned husband rather than an active duty operator. His teammates would provide support through unofficial channels, sharing intelligence and resources without appearing on any official documentation. The cover story required Marcus to surrender his military equipment and identification, traveling with civilian credentials and commercial gear. But his teammates ensured that his civilian equipment included some of the most advanced survival and tracking technology available to special operations forces, carefully concealed within apparently innocent items. Marcus reached the abandoned campsite 18 hours after Sarah's disappearance, driving a rented civilian vehicle that attracted less attention than military transport. The scene told a story that immediately contradicted the official theory about equipment failure or accidental separation from her vehicle. Sarah's Land Rover showed clear evidence of deliberate sabotage rather than mechanical breakdown. Critical engine components had been carefully removed with tools, not damaged by failure or accident. The tire tracks around the campsite indicated multiple vehicles, and a coordinated operation rather than a spontaneous encounter with local militants. Most importantly, Marcus found clear evidence that Sarah had survived the initial incident and begun moving strategically through the surrounding terrain. Her boot prints showed a deliberate pattern of movement toward higher ground, consistent with someone trained to seek defensive positions and water sources. She was alive, aware, and thinking tactically. The tracking skills Marcus had learned during years of hunting high-value targets in similar terrain allowed him to follow Sarah's trail where others might have lost it completely. She had moved carefully to avoid leaving obvious signs, but she had also left subtle markers that someone who knew her methods would recognize. A small pile of rocks arranged in a specific pattern indicated direction of travel. Broken vegetation at precise intervals suggested deliberate signaling rather than random movement. Sarah was communicating with potential rescuers while avoiding detection by hostile forces, using techniques she had learned from Marcus during their years together. The trail led higher into the mountains, toward terrain that offered both greater security and increased exposure to environmental dangers. Sarah was gambling that rescue forces would find her before cold, dehydration, or hostile contact proved fatal. Marcus realized that her survival depended on maintaining that delicate balance for potentially several more days. Following the trail required moving carefully to avoid alerting local populations to his presence. The valley contained several small settlements where Taliban sympathizers might report unusual activity to militant leaders. Marcus used his knowledge of local customs and languages to gather information without revealing his true purpose or capabilities. An elderly shepherd named Mahmoud provided the first concrete intelligence about Sarah's situation. He had observed the contractors' vehicles and heard heated arguments in English before they departed. More importantly, he had seen a lone figure moving through the upper valley after the vehicles left, someone who moved like a soldier rather than a lost civilian. Mahmoud was suspicious of foreigners after decades of conflict, but he recognized something familiar in Marcus's bearing and approach. When Marcus demonstrated respect for local customs and spoke in fluent Pashto, the old man began sharing more detailed observations about recent activities in the valley. The contractor unit had been operating in the region for several weeks, claiming to conduct security assessments for international development organizations. But Mahmoud had noticed that their activities focused more on monitoring smuggling routes than protecting humanitarian workers. The unit seemed particularly interested in locations where different militant groups conducted weapons transfers. This intelligence confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion that Sarah had stumbled into something far more dangerous than random criminal activity. Arms trafficking in the region involved networks that spanned multiple countries and included participants from various military organizations. Sarah's disappearance might be connected to attempts to silence someone who had inadvertently documented their operations. Marcus contacted his teammates through encrypted civilian communications equipment, sharing his findings and requesting additional intelligence support. Sergeant First Class Thompson began monitoring communications traffic related to known arms trafficking networks, searching for any references to recent security problems or personnel elimination operations. The intelligence picture that emerged over the following hours painted a disturbing scenario. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and his contractor unit were indeed involved in illegal weapons sales, but their operation was larger and more sophisticated than initially suspected. They had been selling weapons to multiple factions simultaneously, playing different groups against each other while profiting from sustained conflict. Sarah's humanitarian mapping project had inadvertently created a detailed record of their supply routes, meeting locations, and timing patterns. Her reports contained enough evidence to expose the entire network and connect it to specific military personnel and contractor organizations. Hayes couldn't afford to let her share that information with appropriate authorities. The decision to abandon Sarah in the wilderness represented a calculated attempt to eliminate a threat while maintaining plausible deniability. If she died of exposure or hostile contact, her disappearance would appear to be a tragic consequence of working in a dangerous environment. Hayes and his associates would escape accountability while continuing their profitable illegal activities. But they had made a fundamental error in their assessment of Sarah's capabilities and resources. They treated her like a typical civilian contractor rather than someone with extensive survival training and connections to elite military units. Their plan assumed that she would panic, make poor decisions, and die quickly from exposure or hostile contact. Marcus knew his wife better than that. Sarah had spent years learning to function under extreme stress, and she possessed both the knowledge and determination to survive in hostile environments significantly longer than her captors anticipated. She was buying time for rescue forces to locate her, but she couldn't survive indefinitely without water, shelter, and protection from both environmental and human threats. The search pattern Marcus developed focused on locations where Sarah could find water while maintaining defensive positions. The terrain offered several possibilities: seasonal springs, hidden valleys, and cave systems that provided both resources and concealment. Each potential location required careful investigation to avoid walking into ambushes or alerting hostile observers. As darkness fell on Sarah's second day missing, Marcus established a concealed observation post overlooking the valley where she had last been seen. His night vision equipment revealed heat signatures and movement patterns that indicated continued activity in the region. Several groups were searching the area, but Marcus couldn't determine whether they represented rescue forces or hostile elements. The complexity of the tactical situation required patience and careful analysis. Moving too quickly might lead Marcus into the same trap that had claimed Sarah, but delaying action increased the risk that environmental factors or hostile contact would prove fatal before rescue arrived. Marcus spent the night monitoring communications and movement patterns while developing multiple contingency plans for different scenarios. If Sarah was being held captive, the approach would require different tactics than if she was hiding independently. If she had been injured during the initial incident, time factors would become even more critical. Dawn brought new intelligence and increased urgency. Sergeant First Class Thompson reported intercepted communications indicating that Hayes's unit was preparing to leave the region permanently. They had apparently decided that Sarah's disappearance would be attributed to local criminal activity, allowing them to escape before any investigation could connect them to her fate. This development meant that Marcus had perhaps 24 hours to locate Sarah before her captors disappeared beyond the reach of justice. It also suggested that Hayes might be planning to eliminate loose ends before departing, potentially including Sarah if she had somehow survived longer than expected. The time for careful reconnaissance had ended. Marcus needed to find his wife quickly, and that meant taking calculated risks that might expose his presence to hostile forces. But 8 years of marriage to Sarah had taught him that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was unacceptable loss. Sarah's second night in the mountains tested every survival skill she had ever learned. The temperature dropped to near freezing, and the improvised shelter she had constructed from the abandoned paunch and scattered rocks provided minimal protection from the cutting wind. She had found water at a small spring hidden among the boulders, but her food consisted only of a few energy bars from her emergency supplies. The real challenge wasn't physical discomfort. It was the constant awareness that multiple groups were searching the valley below. Sarah could hear vehicles moving along distant roads and occasional helicopter flights that might represent either rescue operations or hostile forces trying to confirm her death. She had no way to signal friendly units without potentially alerting enemies to her location. During the long hours of darkness, Sarah reflected on the intelligence she had gathered about the arms trafficking operation. Her humanitarian mapping project had documented far more than she initially realized. The seemingly routine reports about supply routes and local population movements had inadvertently created a comprehensive picture of Hayes's illegal network. The contractors had been operating with sophisticated planning and coordination that suggested connections to larger criminal organizations. Their ability to access military equipment and intelligence indicated corruption within legitimate military units. Sarah possessed evidence that could expose multiple levels of illegal activity, making her elimination a priority for people with significant resources and motivation. But Sarah also understood that her survival represented more than personal safety. It was a critical factor in preventing continued harm to innocent populations. Hayes's weapons trafficking operation fueled ongoing conflict that killed civilians and undermined reconstruction efforts throughout the region. Her testimony could help dismantle a network that profited from human suffering. As dawn approached, Sarah made a decision that would prove crucial to her survival and rescue. Instead of continuing to hide passively, she would actively gather more evidence about the trafficking operation while evading capture. Her humanitarian work had taught her to observe and document carefully, skills that could now serve a different but equally important purpose. The spring where she had found water was located near what appeared to be an abandoned Soviet-era military installation. The concrete bunkers and tunnels had been partially destroyed decades earlier, but the remaining structures provided both concealment and elevated observation positions. Sarah realized that this location offered an ideal base for monitoring activities in the valley below. From her concealed position among the ruins, Sarah could observe vehicle movements, communication activities, and personnel behavior patterns without exposing herself to detection. She began documenting everything she saw, creating a detailed record that could support future prosecution efforts even if she didn't survive to testify personally. The observation work revealed disturbing information about the scale of Hayes's operation. Multiple contractor units were operating throughout the region, coordinating activities that involved not only weapons trafficking, but also intelligence gathering and possible assassination operations. Sarah had stumbled into something far more sophisticated and dangerous than simple criminal activity. On her third morning in hiding, Sarah observed a meeting between Hayes's unit and representatives from what appeared to be a legitimate military organization. The participants included officers wearing uniforms she recognized from coalition forces, suggesting that the corruption extended into official military channels. The implications were staggering. Trusted military personnel were actively participating in operations that undermined mission objectives and endangered civilian populations. The meeting location was carefully chosen for security, situated in a valley that offered multiple escape routes while providing clear sight lines against potential surveillance. But the participants hadn't considered the possibility that someone might be observing from the abandoned military installation above their position. Using techniques Marcus had taught her for long-range observation, Sarah was able to identify specific individuals and document their activities without specialized equipment. Her humanitarian training in cultural observation and documentation proved surprisingly applicable to intelligence-gathering operations. The information she collected during this surveillance session included vehicle license numbers, communication frequencies, and timing patterns that could help law enforcement agencies track the trafficking network. More importantly, she photographed several key participants using her backup camera, creating evidence that could support prosecutions even if other documentation was lost. But the surveillance work also revealed immediate threats to her safety. Hayes's unit was conducting systematic searches of the surrounding area, moving methodically through terrain features where someone might hide. They were clearly concerned about the possibility that Sarah had survived longer than expected, and they were taking no chances about potential witnesses to their activities. The search pattern indicated professional training and coordination that exceeded typical contractor capabilities. These weren't ordinary mercenaries conducting a casual elimination operation. They were experienced military personnel executing a mission with the same attention to detail they would apply to official combat operations. Sarah realized that her position among the ruins would eventually be discovered if the search continued at its current pace. She needed to relocate while maintaining her ability to observe and document ongoing activities. The terrain offered several alternative positions, but moving during daylight hours would risk exposure to both ground searchers and aerial surveillance. The decision to move came when Sarah observed Hayes's unit bringing in additional personnel and equipment that suggested a major expansion of search operations. They were clearly prepared to invest significant resources in confirming her death, indicating that the stakes involved were higher than she had initially understood. Sarah waited until late afternoon when changing light conditions would complicate visual detection before beginning her movement to an alternative position. She followed a route that took advantage of natural concealment while avoiding areas where the search teams were likely to establish observation posts. The new position was located in a cave system that had been used by various groups throughout decades of conflict. The caves provided protection from both weather and detection, but they also contained evidence of recent occupation by unknown parties. Sarah found ammunition caches, communication equipment, and supplies that suggested ongoing use by militant organizations. This discovery created both opportunities and dangers for Sarah's situation. The supplies included food, water, and warm clothing that could extend her survival time significantly. But the location was also clearly important to local militant groups who would not welcome unauthorized occupation of their resources. Sarah made the calculated decision to use the supplies while preparing to evacuate quickly if the legitimate owners returned. She also began exploring the cave system to identify alternative escape routes and defensive positions. Her military training emphasized the importance of always having multiple options available when operating in hostile territory. The exploration revealed that the cave system was far more extensive than initially apparent, with tunnels that extended deep into the mountain and connected to openings on the opposite side of the ridge. Some passages showed evidence of recent excavation, suggesting that they were being actively developed for strategic purposes. Most importantly, Sarah discovered communication equipment that was still functional. The radio system appeared to be connected to a larger network that included multiple frequencies and encryption capabilities. After careful consideration, she decided to risk using the equipment to contact friendly forces, despite the possibility that hostile parties might be monitoring the same frequencies. Sarah's first transmission was carefully crafted to provide maximum information while minimizing the risk of interception by hostile forces. She used code words and references that Marcus would recognize, but that would be meaningless to others monitoring the frequencies. The message included her approximate location, the nature of the threat she faced, and critical intelligence about the arms trafficking operation. The response came within minutes, confirming that Delta Force units in the region had received her transmission and were moving to provide assistance. But the response also included warnings about hostile activity in the area and instructions to remain concealed until rescue forces could establish secure perimeter control. Sarah acknowledged the instructions while continuing to monitor communications traffic on multiple frequencies. The intercepts revealed that Hayes's unit had detected radio activity in the region and was attempting to triangulate the source of transmissions. They were clearly concerned about the possibility that Sarah had gained access to communication capabilities. The discovery that Sarah might be actively communicating with rescue forces prompted a dramatic escalation in search operations. Hayes brought in additional personnel and equipment, including electronic surveillance gear designed to locate unauthorized radio transmissions. The search pattern became more aggressive and systematic, indicating determination to eliminate the threat before outside forces could intervene effectively. Sarah realized that her situation had fundamentally changed from passive survival to active evasion of a determined enemy with superior resources and training. The communication capabilities that offered hope of rescue had also increased the immediate danger to her safety. She needed to balance the requirement to guide rescue forces with the necessity of avoiding detection by hostile units that were actively hunting her. The cave system that had provided safety was now potentially compromised by her radio activities. Sarah began preparing for emergency evacuation while maintaining communication with friendly forces about the tactical situation. The next few hours would determine whether her survival gamble had succeeded or created the circumstances for her capture and elimination. But Sarah Mitchell had not spent years in conflict zones without learning to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. She had survived the initial betrayal, gathered critical intelligence, and established contact with rescue forces. The final phase of her ordeal would require different skills and greater risks, but she had proven her ability to think tactically under extreme pressure. The real test was whether her husband and his Delta Force teammates could reach her before Hayes's contractors succeeded in their elimination mission. Time was running out, but Sarah had bought herself the most precious resource possible, the knowledge that professional rescuers were aware of her situation and moving to provide assistance. The stage was set for a confrontation between two highly trained military units with completely different objectives. One determined to silence a witness to illegal activities, the other committed to protecting a teammate's wife and exposing a dangerous criminal operation. Sarah would be both the prize and the key witness in whatever battle followed. Her survival had already exceeded her captor's expectations and plans. Now she needed to stay alive long enough for rescue to arrive, while continuing to gather evidence that could bring Hayes's entire network to justice. The mountains of Afghanistan had become the stage for a very personal war with implications that extended far beyond one woman's survival. Marcus received Sarah's coded transmission while conducting final reconnaissance of the valley where she had disappeared. Her message contained intelligence that changed everything about the tactical situation. She wasn't just surviving. She was actively gathering evidence about a criminal operation that threatened ongoing military missions throughout the region. The radio intercept also revealed that Sarah had found shelter and supplies, extending her potential survival time significantly. But Hayes's unit was escalating their search operations in response to detected radioactivity, creating urgent pressure for immediate rescue action. Marcus realized that he had perhaps 6 hours before hostile forces would locate and eliminate his wife. Master Sergeant Rodriguez and the rest of Marcus's Delta Force team had been monitoring the situation through unofficial channels, ready to provide support if circumstances allowed them to act without compromising their official mission status. Sarah's intelligence about arms trafficking networks gave them legitimate operational justification for direct intervention. The decision to launch an immediate rescue operation required careful coordination between multiple military units and agencies. Colonel Patterson, Marcus's commanding officer, initially expressed concern about resource allocation and political implications. But the intelligence Sarah had gathered about corruption within coalition forces created national security imperatives that overcame normal procedural constraints. Rodriguez contacted Lieutenant Colonel James Brooks, commanding officer of another Delta Force unit operating in the region, to coordinate a joint operation that would provide sufficient personnel and firepower to overcome Hayes's contractor force. Brooks had been investigating suspicious arms transfers for several weeks, and Sarah's intelligence offered the breakthrough his team needed to take decisive action. The operational plan developed by the combined Delta Force teams reflected years of experience conducting hostage rescue and high-value target elimination missions in similar terrain. They would establish multiple approach routes, maintain constant communication, and coordinate timing to achieve complete tactical surprise while minimizing risk to Sarah's safety. Marcus would lead the primary assault team directly toward Sarah's last known position, using his intimate knowledge of her survival training and psychological responses to locate her quickly. Rodriguez would command the secondary team responsible for neutralizing Hayes's search units and preventing their escape or reinforcement. Sergeant First Class Thompson coordinated communication intercepts and electronic warfare operations designed to disrupt Hayes's coordination capabilities while maintaining contact with Sarah. Staff Sergeant Kim led the long-range surveillance team that would provide intelligence about enemy positions and movement patterns during the operation. The timing was critical because Hayes's unit was preparing to expand their search operations with additional personnel and equipment scheduled to arrive within hours. If the rescue operation didn't succeed quickly, Sarah would face overwhelming enemy forces that even Delta Force units might struggle to overcome. Marcus began his approach to Sarah's position using infiltration techniques that allowed him to move through hostile territory without detection. The route took advantage of terrain features and timing patterns that minimized exposure to enemy observation while maintaining rapid progress toward the target area. The abandoned Soviet military installation where Sarah had taken shelter was ideally suited for defensive operations, but it also presented challenges for rescue forces. The concrete structures that protected Sarah from enemy detection could also conceal hostile forces waiting in ambush positions. Marcus used thermal imaging equipment to scan the installation for heat signatures while maintaining communication with Sarah through the captured radio system. Her responses confirmed her location and provided detailed intelligence about the cave system, where she had found supplies and defensive positions. The information Sarah provided about the cave network was crucial for planning the rescue operation. The multiple tunnel entrances and alternative escape routes meant that hostile forces could approach from several directions simultaneously, but they also offered opportunities for Sarah to evade capture while rescue forces engaged enemy units. Rodriguez's team established observation positions overlooking the valley approaches where Hayes's search units were operating. The intelligence picture that emerged from their surveillance revealed a sophisticated operation involving at least 20 personnel with military-grade equipment and coordination capabilities. Hayes had divided his forces into multiple search teams that moved systematically through potential hiding locations while maintaining communication and mutual support. The operation reflected professional military planning rather than typical contractor improvisation, confirming suspicions about the level of training and resources available to the criminal organization. The Delta Force teams realized that they were facing opponents with capabilities similar to their own, requiring tactical approaches that assumed enemy familiarity with special operations procedures. The rescue operation would succeed only through superior planning, coordination, and execution, rather than overwhelming advantages in training or equipment. Marcus reached the perimeter of the military installation as Hayes's primary search team began their final approach to Sarah's position. The timing created both immediate danger and tactical opportunity. Sarah was minutes away from discovery, but the enemy forces were concentrated in a location where Delta Force units could engage them effectively. The assault began with coordinated strikes against Hayes's communication facilities and vehicle positions, designed to isolate individual enemy units while preventing coordination of their defensive response. Thompson's electronic warfare operations disrupted radio communications, while kinetic strikes eliminated transportation and heavy weapons capabilities. Rodriguez's team engaged the main search force in the valley below the installation, using superior positioning and firepower to pin down enemy personnel, while Marcus moved to extract Sarah from the cave system. The engagement was designed to create maximum confusion while minimizing risk to civilian populations in nearby settlements. Marcus reached Sarah's position as hostile forces were beginning their assault on the cave entrances. Her defensive preparation and knowledge of the tunnel system allowed her to evade initial contact, while providing Marcus with detailed information about enemy positions and intentions through radio communication. The reunion between Marcus and Sarah took place under intense hostile fire, but their years of training together allowed them to coordinate immediately without extensive discussion. Sarah had prepared multiple escape routes and defensive positions that gave them options for movement regardless of how the tactical situation developed. Hayes himself led the assault on the cave system, apparently determined to eliminate Sarah personally rather than relying on subordinates to complete the mission. His presence on the battlefield created both additional danger and strategic opportunity. Capturing Hayes alive would provide access to intelligence about the entire trafficking network. The firefight in the cave system tested the combat skills that Sarah had learned during years of training with Marcus and his teammates. She moved effectively under fire, provided accurate intelligence about enemy positions, and maintained tactical discipline despite the stress of life-threatening combat. Marcus realized that Sarah's survival training and combat exposure had transformed her from a protected civilian into someone capable of functioning as an effective member of a military team under extreme conditions. Her actions during the firefight demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of many professionally trained soldiers. The tactical turning point came when Rodriguez's team succeeded in flanking Hayes's support units, forcing them to choose between continuing their assault on the caves or defending their own positions against attack from multiple directions. The decision to withdraw from the cave assault gave Marcus and Sarah the opportunity to escape through alternative tunnel exits. But Hayes was unwilling to accept the failure of his elimination mission. He pursued Marcus and Sarah through the tunnel system with a small team of his most experienced operatives, apparently determined to complete the assassination even at the cost of his own survival and that of his remaining personnel. The pursuit through the underground tunnel network created unique tactical challenges for both sides. The confined spaces and limited visibility favored defensive operations, but they also prevented the use of heavy weapons or coordinated team movements that might have provided decisive advantages. Sarah's knowledge of the tunnel layout, gained through her exploration while hiding, proved crucial for maintaining mobility advantages over pursuing enemy forces. She guided Marcus through passages and alternative routes that Hayes's team couldn't predict or counter effectively. The final confrontation took place in a large chamber deep within the mountain, where Hayes caught up with Marcus and Sarah as they attempted to reach an exit tunnel that would lead to safety. The engagement was conducted at close range with limited maneuvering room, creating conditions where individual combat skills became decisive factors. Hayes proved to be a formidable opponent with extensive combat experience and determination that matched his criminal ambitions. But he was facing Marcus Mitchell, a Delta Force operator with years of experience in similar close-quarters, combat situations, and additional motivation provided by threats to his wife's safety. Sarah contributed to the final engagement by providing tactical support and maintaining communication with Rodriguez's team, which was moving to provide backup through alternative tunnel approaches. Her ability to function effectively under extreme stress proved decisive in coordinating the actions that led to Hayes's defeat and capture. The capture of Hayes alive provided immediate access to intelligence about the arms trafficking network that had motivated Sarah's attempted assassination. Under interrogation, he revealed information that led to the arrest of multiple military personnel and contractor operatives throughout the region. But the most important outcome of the rescue operation was Sarah's survival and her ability to provide testimony that exposed the full scope of the criminal activities she had inadvertently documented. Her evidence led to prosecutions that dismantled a trafficking network responsible for fueling conflicts and causing civilian casualties throughout Central Asia. The rescue operation concluded with the evacuation of Marcus and Sarah to secure medical facilities where she could receive treatment for exposure and stress injuries sustained during her ordeal. But her physical recovery was complicated by psychological challenges related to her transformation from humanitarian worker to combat participant. Rodriguez and his team completed the mission by securing the cave system and collecting additional evidence about the trafficking operation. The intelligence gathered during the rescue operation provided foundation for ongoing investigations that revealed corruption and criminal activity, extending far beyond the immediate participants. The official reports about the rescue operation emphasized the successful elimination of a terrorist threat and the recovery of valuable intelligence about criminal networks operating in the region. Sarah's role was described as that of a protected civilian rather than an active participant in combat operations. But Marcus and his teammates understood that Sarah had proven herself capable of far more than civilian protection and support. Her survival, intelligence gathering, and combat performance demonstrated qualities that earned respect from professional soldiers who rarely acknowledged such capabilities in non-military personnel. The rescue had succeeded, but its implications extended far beyond one woman's survival. The evidence Sarah had gathered would continue generating consequences for criminal organizations and corrupt officials for months to come. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed the destruction of a network that threatened both military operations and civilian populations throughout the region. The aftermath of Sarah's rescue operation created ripple effects that extended far beyond the mountains of Afghanistan. Within 72 hours, military investigators and federal prosecutors were coordinating the largest investigation of military contractor corruption in decades. Sarah's evidence had opened a door to criminal networks that operated across multiple countries and involved personnel at the highest levels of several military organizations. Hayes's capture provided immediate access to financial records, communication logs, and operational plans that revealed the staggering scope of the arms trafficking operation. Under interrogation, he attempted to minimize his role while implicating others, but the documentary evidence Sarah had gathered made denial impossible. The operation had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits while directly contributing to civilian casualties throughout Central Asia. Sarah spent 2 weeks in military medical facilities receiving treatment for dehydration, exposure injuries, and psychological trauma. But her physical recovery was complicated by the knowledge that she would soon become the star witness in prosecutions that would target powerful individuals with extensive resources and motivation to prevent her testimony. The medical staff treating Sarah were amazed by her psychological resilience and adaptability. Most civilian hostages required extensive counseling and rehabilitation after similar ordeals, but Sarah demonstrated emotional stability that reflected years of preparation and training. Her experience as a humanitarian worker in conflict zones had provided psychological tools that proved surprisingly applicable to combat survival. Dr. Patricia Morgan, the military psychologist assigned to Sarah's case, noted that her patient had experienced a fundamental transformation during her ordeal in the mountains. Sarah had discovered capabilities and confidence that would permanently change her approach to dangerous situations. The shy humanitarian aid worker had been replaced by someone who understood her own capacity for survival and tactical thinking under extreme pressure. Marcus remained at Sarah's side throughout her medical treatment, but he was also required to participate in extensive debriefings about the rescue operation and its intelligence implications. Military investigators wanted detailed accounts of every aspect of the mission, from initial planning through final execution. The operation had succeeded brilliantly, but it had also revealed systemic problems that required comprehensive analysis and response. Colonel Patterson commended Marcus and his teammates for their professional execution of a complex rescue mission, but he also expressed concern about the precedent set by allowing personal relationships to influence operational decisions. The success of Sarah's rescue created pressure to authorize similar operations in future cases, potentially compromising mission effectiveness and resource allocation. Master Sergeant Rodriguez defended the team's actions by emphasizing the intelligence value of Sarah's rescue and the national security implications of the trafficking network they had exposed. The operation had achieved multiple objectives simultaneously, saving a civilian life, eliminating a criminal threat, and gathering evidence that would prevent future harm to military personnel and local populations. The legal proceedings that followed Hayes's arrest created unprecedented challenges for military prosecutors accustomed to dealing with conventional war crimes and military justice violations. The arms trafficking network had operated across multiple jurisdictions and involved both military personnel and civilian contractors, requiring coordination between various agencies and legal systems. Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh took primary responsibility for coordinating the prosecution efforts, working with military attorneys to develop cases that would survive challenges from defense teams representing individuals with extensive resources and political connections. The evidence Sarah had gathered provided the foundation for prosecutions, but converting that evidence into successful convictions required careful legal strategy and preparation. Sarah's testimony before a federal grand jury provided compelling evidence about the scope and impact of the trafficking operation. Her detailed documentation of supply routes, timing patterns, and personnel interactions created a comprehensive picture that prosecutors could use to demonstrate criminal intent and coordination. But her testimony also revealed the personal cost of her involvement in exposing the network. Hayes's defense attorneys attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by claiming that her evidence had been gathered illegally and that her survival story was exaggerated for dramatic effect. They portrayed her as a publicity-seeking civilian who had interfered with legitimate military contractor operations. The strategy required Sarah to relive her ordeal repeatedly while defending her credibility against skilled legal professionals. The defense efforts failed because Sarah's evidence was corroborated by physical evidence, communication intercepts, and testimony from other witnesses. Hayes's own financial records and communication logs supported every major element of Sarah's account. Most importantly, several of his subordinates agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences, providing insider perspectives that confirmed Sarah's observations. The trial proceedings attracted international attention as details of the trafficking network became public knowledge. News organizations covered the story extensively, focusing on both the dramatic rescue operation and the broader implications of military contractor corruption. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought and struggled to maintain privacy while fulfilling her obligations as a witness. Hayes was ultimately convicted on multiple charges including arms trafficking, attempted murder, conspiracy, and violations of military contractor regulations. His sentence included 30 years in federal prison and forfeiture of assets valued at over $8 million. The conviction sent a clear message to other potential participants in similar criminal enterprises. But Hayes's conviction was only the beginning of a prosecution effort that eventually involved over 40 individuals in various military and contractor organizations. Sarah's evidence provided leads that investigators followed across multiple countries, exposing corruption networks that had operated for years without detection. The investigations resulted in policy changes designed to prevent similar criminal exploitation of military contracting systems. Sarah's role as a witness in multiple trials required her to travel extensively and spend months away from her humanitarian work. The legal proceedings became a full-time occupation that fundamentally changed her career plans and personal objectives. She discovered that exposing corruption required as much dedication and sacrifice as providing humanitarian aid. The psychological impact of her transformation from humanitarian worker to crime-fighting witness created challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated. She found it difficult to return to traditional aid work after experiencing the satisfaction of bringing criminals to justice. Her perspective on conflict zones had changed from focusing primarily on helping victims to understanding the importance of eliminating the sources of their suffering. Marcus supported Sarah's involvement in the prosecution efforts, but he also worried about the long-term impact on her safety and psychological well-being. The criminal networks they had exposed included individuals with extensive resources and motivation for revenge. Sarah would need to maintain security precautions for years to come, potentially affecting every aspect of their personal and professional lives. The success of the prosecution efforts created opportunities for Sarah to transition into new professional roles that utilized her unique experience and capabilities. Several government agencies offered positions that would allow her to continue fighting trafficking networks while applying her humanitarian background to policy development and operational planning. Sarah ultimately accepted a position with the Department of Justice as a special advisor on international trafficking investigations. The role allowed her to work with prosecutors and investigators while contributing her first-hand knowledge of how criminal networks operate in conflict environments. She became a bridge between humanitarian organizations and law enforcement agencies, helping both sides understand their shared interests in protecting civilian populations. The new position required extensive training in investigative techniques and legal procedures, but Sarah adapted quickly to requirements that seemed challenging after her mountain survival experience. She discovered that her ordeal had provided confidence and analytical skills that proved surprisingly applicable to complex legal and investigative work. Marcus adjusted his own military assignments to accommodate Sarah's new career requirements and security concerns. His commanding officers recognized that his wife's expertise made her a valuable national security asset deserving of protection and support. The couple developed new patterns of living and working that reflected their shared commitment to fighting criminal networks while maintaining their personal relationship. The publicity surrounding Sarah's rescue and the subsequent prosecutions created public awareness about military contractor corruption that led to legislative reforms and increased oversight. Congressional hearings examined the systemic failures that had allowed trafficking networks to operate within military contracting systems, resulting in new regulations and accountability measures. Sarah testified before multiple congressional committees, providing recommendations based on her experience about how humanitarian organizations and law enforcement agencies could coordinate more effectively to identify and combat trafficking operations. Her suggestions influenced policy changes that improved information sharing and investigation procedures. The village where Sarah had been establishing her medical clinic became a symbol of successful humanitarian work after coalition forces eliminated the trafficking networks that had been destabilizing the region. Ahmad Khan, the village elder who had welcomed Sarah's initial project, sent messages expressing gratitude for her role in bringing peace and security to his community. Dr. Harrison and Maria Santos, Sarah's colleagues who had been left behind when she disappeared, resumed their medical clinic work with enhanced security provided by military forces that understood the connection between humanitarian aid and counter-trafficking operations. Their project became a model for coordination between civilian organizations and military units. 5 years after her rescue, Sarah had testified in over a dozen major prosecutions and contributed to investigations that dismantled trafficking networks on 3 continents. Her evidence had led to convictions that prevented countless future crimes and saved lives throughout regions affected by illegal arms transfers. The personal cost of her transformation included the loss of anonymity and the constant awareness of potential threats from individuals seeking revenge for their criminal associates' convictions. But Sarah had discovered a sense of purpose and effectiveness that exceeded anything she had experienced in traditional humanitarian work. Marcus continued his military career with enhanced appreciation for the connections between military operations and civilian humanitarian efforts. His experience rescuing Sarah had demonstrated that protecting civilian populations sometimes required unconventional approaches that transcended traditional military and law enforcement boundaries. Their marriage had survived extreme stress and emerged stronger because both partners had discovered new dimensions of their capabilities and commitment. Sarah's ordeal had revealed strength and courage that Marcus had always suspected, but never seen fully demonstrated. Marcus's rescue operation had proven devotion and competence that Sarah had trusted, but never witnessed under such extreme conditions. The mountains of Afghanistan, where Sarah had nearly died, became symbols of resilience and justice, rather than abandonment and criminal exploitation. The evidence she had gathered while fighting for survival had created consequences that would protect future generations of both military personnel and civilian populations from criminal networks that profited from conflict and suffering. Sarah Mitchell had been abandoned in the Wasteland by criminals who underestimated her capabilities and the determination of those who loved her. Their miscalculation had led not only to their own destruction, but to the exposure of criminal networks that had operated with impunity for years. Her survival and subsequent testimony had transformed her from victim to victor, from humanitarian aid worker to crime-fighting advocate. The story of her abandonment and rescue became legendary within special operations communities, but the real significance lay in the lasting impact on criminal prosecution and prevention efforts. Sarah had proven that one person's courage and determination could create consequences that extended far beyond their individual survival, affecting the safety and security of countless others. Delta Force's response to her abandonment had been swift, professional, and devastatingly effective. But Sarah's own response, surviving, gathering evidence, and fighting for justice, had proven equally impressive and far more lasting in its impact on the criminal networks that threatened both military operations and civilian populations throughout the world.